If you want to be a movie buff, there's a few crucial moments of film history that no one's going to teach you about. One of those unrecognized movements is Gremlin ripoffs. Now, in a lot of places, ripping off ideas is frowned upon, but in horror, the truth is that a lot of these subgenres that have developed come from people ripping off each other's ideas. Like, slasher movies are at a point where no one looks at those anymore and thinks to themselves, hey, that's a Halloween ripoff. And another horror genre I'd love to see that happen with is the ripoffs of Gremlins. Now, Gremlins isn't the very first movie to use little monsters, but I would say it's really the first to blend children's and adult genres together in this especially spicy way. Steven Spielberg produced this, and you can definitely see the influence that E.T. has on this with this very nostalgic suburban family setting that becomes wrapped up in this enchantment. Now take that, which is something everyone loves, and have Joe Dante thrust in campy genre thrills, and you get the movie that at least partially inspired the PG-13 rating. But really, it's in that space where you're going to find the most fun-loving vibes you'll find in horror genre ever. To come to this genre and this market and choose to make a movie about creatures like the Ghoulies means we have transcended meatheads trying to outdo each other's violent imaginations. We are entering into the higher level of consciousness of goofball mode. This is just a style I have no problem people ripping off. Like, listen folks, we don't have to all bend over backwards to genuinely upset each other with our movies, when we could just have fun with some ugly little dudes. I mean, some of these do try to be more scary than others, but all of them are dominated by this goofy, absurdist mood, which I find very, very fun. Okay, so the first real true Gremlin ripoff that came out was Ghoulies. First of all, I'm going to be fighting the urge to send this straight to the top just because of the cover. We need to take a moment to appreciate the beauty of this image. Not only are we seeing the first de-evolved gremlin-like monster coming out of a toilet, he's also wearing a tiny blue shirt and suspenders. So soak it all in because this actually doesn't even happen in the movie. So Ghoulies was released like less than a year from Gremlins by Empire Pictures, which would later become Full Moon, which is one of the most prolific genre movie companies ever. There's honestly just so much I could say about Full Moon. If you've ever spent much time in video rental stores, you've seen their movies on the shelves. The man behind it all is Charles Band, who really is just like one of the first people to ever get into home video of like any kind at all. I mean, he's produced like literally hundreds of movies that are all just pure genre pulp. Full Moon has always had this bizarre dichotomy of being absolutely shamelessly cheap and also being earnestly committed to the enchantment of genre movies. Anyway, sometimes he'd even like shoot two movies on the same set at the same time with the exact same alcoholic crew that they hired. But he still just hustled his way to getting his hands on all these incredible shooting locations that just brought tons of gothy vibes that others were like spending millions of dollars to recreate. Pay-by-number stories are pretty typical. Like just this movie Ghoulies is basically like this, unsuspecting party people recklessly unleashing evil that's been repeated over and over throughout the entire horror genre. I think the creative force that really defined the Full Moon style was some of the people that worked on this specific movie, like Charles Band's brother, Richard Band, doing music, and John Carl Buechler doing special effects. And John Carl Buechler is going to come up again soon, but he very naturally has shown throughout his whole career that gremlin-adjacent characters are his passion. I mean, in fact, after this came out, like, little ugly creatures kind of became Full Moon's cash cow. And I really feel like it stems from the aesthetic that was formed and solidified with this very movie, Ghoulies. The stories where this couple inherits this house and they're walking around all oblivious to just the absolute screaming red flags, stuff like tombstones with pentagrams on them in the backyard. And it's in this house that they still think it's a good idea to try and do a ritual. And then his wife acts all surprised when his eyes go crooked with evil. But what I love about this is this horror story is played so straight and occasionally is genuinely creepy in my opinion. And without any good explanation, there's beautifully stupid looking creatures John Carl Buechler made running around that are clearly hilarious. And the movie just like refuses to acknowledge that fact. This one's my favorite. I think it's supposed to be a cat. Definitely one of those things where they go from cute to ugly and then back to cute again. Look at this little guy's legs. Ghoulies spend most of their time just being like a cheerleader for whoever has the most magic at the time. But, when things start to escalate, I think there get some like these little dwarf people that come and show up to be a servant to the warlock, and they just start to literally throw ghoulies on people to kill them. If you don't see the visual comedy in that, I really don't know what to tell you. Just really fun horror moods all around, I think. So Ghoulies, the suspender ghoulie does not happen in the movie, so you're not going straight to the top. I am going to put you at A. The thing is most modern serious horror fans would watch this and not think it's a good movie. But for those who are enlightened, who are goofy pilled, they are going to see this as an A movie, I think. So the next movie is Troll. It came out in 1986. So you remember when I said Full Moon made Little Creatures one of their cash cows. So you shouldn't be surprised that our next movie, released like a year after Ghoulies, is another Full Moon movie. But I don't think it's redundant because Troll is very special for a lot of reasons that can't be ignored. For one thing, this was actually directed by John Carl Buechler this time, the guy who did the effects for Ghoulies. And to be honest, if it wasn't for the imagination behind those creatures, the Ghoulies really wouldn't be much. So letting him apply his creativity to a whole movie was an incredible move. And this movie is far more influential than most people realize. For one thing, everyone knows about Troll 2 now. Okay, and the big part of the joke is it's not being clear that there's ever really a Troll 1. But we all know now that that's exactly what seedy Italian directors were doing at that time. It's spotting financially successful American movies and making fake sequels for them. They're both about trolls who are obsessed with plants. There is no way this wasn't the movie that inspired that fake sequel. Now, there's some conjecture here because it could totally be a coincidence that both the lead character, who is played by freaking Atreyu, and his dad are named Harry Potter.
Here, let me help you out. My name is Harry Potter.
But beyond that, this movie does very much have a very proto-Harry Potter feel to it. What with children discovering trolls and wizards and witches. And Buechler stands out to me among his edgy horror peers because you can see that when he has the most control, like his main passion is childlike enchantment and fantasy. And I'm going to repeat, it's the blending of those genres that makes these movies special. And he did some very strange alchemy when it comes to blending adult genre movies with kid stuff. Like, this is like 85% kids movie and 15% of... Holy shit! And Sonny Bono trying to score. Also, I really shouldn't fail to mention, this was one of Julia Louis-Dreyfus's first role ever. Who would you expect turns into a giggling forest nymph? Like, this is technically a horror movie, but it's possibly one of the most benign horror movies ever made. First of all, you might notice the baby blue and pink color scheme, which is actually beautiful, okay? The cast is mostly comprised of just like super kind adults. This is like a rare moment where both parents in a movie are actually kind of likable. And there's the helpful grandma-like witch, who I think feels very similar to the grandma from Halloween Town, who ends up mentoring our lead kid and ends up doing wizard battles for him. And I can't forget to mention that the grandma witch has a pet mushroom with a face, and she hides it with a lampshade. And it's just one of the most beautiful creations that I'll never see again. If you disagree, wait until you see it sing, okay? And the whole conflict is just about this ugly troll thing showing up in an apartment building, and he starts pretending to be a little girl. And like, her family only notices something's wrong when she starts doing things like pouring juice on the floor and going berserk after mauling a hamburger. And when you think about it, honestly, the only thing this troll ever tries to do is just turn all the jerks in the building into little forest trolls. Which means we get a lot of classic goopy transformation scenes, which are amazing, that not only don't result in anyone's death, but it's more of like a rebirth. Because after they turn into trolls, they just convert all the apartments into fantasy forests where they seem to finally start like actually enjoying a peaceful life. And I mean, surely that lowered the building's carbon footprint. And yes, look closely and you'll see Buechler repurpose the creatures he made for Ghoulies, but look how many more there are now. There's like a whole barnyard of ghoulie monsters in there. And there's like this pretty awkward, but also extremely heartwarming story arc of Phil Fondacaro showing up, and the troll, disguised as a little girl, thinks he's a troll-adjacent creature.
Are you an elf?
No, I just resemble one.
And so she like bonds with him over his disability. And I'll say this, that when it comes to creature design, like this gets an automatic pass straight to the top of the list because the troll has Phil Fondacaro reborn as a healthy Phil Fondacaro troll to live with him. Is this not one of the best things you've ever seen?
Welcome, Brother Elf.
I mean, these are images I'll never forget, and Troll is a high-key anti-hero. There is such an innocent and vitalizing feel to this movie, and I want there to be as much of that as possible on the market. Now, I can totally see how, like, rabid horror fans would put Ghoulies over Troll. Honestly, between the two, I think this is far more special. This really feels much more of like an auteur work than it does a gimmick. Like, every time I watch it, I feel like it's more and more special. And for that reason, I'm putting it at the highest tier. It is an S-level movie, in my opinion. In this context, of course, right? Next up, we have what many would consider a cult classic, Critters. So Critters comes out only like a few months after Troll was released, making 1986 a pretty huge year for these movies. Now, out of all these Gremlin knockoffs, this probably had the best production. It was produced by the major studio New Line Cinema. And with that said, it's also probably trying to be the most like Gremlins. I mean, I can imagine the spark for this movie being that the producers saw a movie like Troll just make absolute bank, even though they didn't have the budget to recreate the carnage and action that was in the original Gremlins. It's almost like with Critters, they had this single-minded mission to recreate the mood of the mom battling gremlins in the kitchen. Which maybe sounds lazy, but honestly, that's just like one of the best scenes of one of the best movies. Trying to recreate that mood is a very noble task, in my opinion. And it's not like they failed either. They probably got like the most perfect people working on this movie, with the director Stephen Herrick, who later went on to make Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, if that gives you any idea of this style. You know, Spielberg magic is definitely the central ingredient to what makes these truly great. And Herrick is a great choice because I feel like both him and Spielberg are very, very nostalgic. But Herrick is nostalgic in a more fun-loving way. Like in Critters, we get to reminisce on a time when the town drunk can just walk right out of the drunk tank and just start making bombs with a kid and not be a serious problem. But there's a very 80s family dynamic with a bickering sibling and a stern father. But here they completely jump any of the fantasy origins and go straight to the more silly sci-fi route with aliens crash landing. And like the second you see what these aliens look like, you'll see how serious this movie takes itself. And honestly, in my opinion, I think that just shows some commitment to the B-movie world in a more classy market where that sort of thing really isn't that cool. But knowing exactly what it wanted, Critters is really a very simple movie where some aliens crash land by this family and start terrorizing them. There's like this side story where these space hunters take the form of an 80s rock star and go on a fish out of water adventure to find the critters. This movie almost reminded me of like Blues Brothers or something in the way it takes joy in destruction. Like whether it's the alien hunter guys or the family, like something is always getting blown up in almost every scene in like the last half of the movie. For the special effects in this, they got another huge talent with the Chiodo brothers. They're like top tier special effects guys who went on to do some really huge work. And in the horror world, they're probably the most notable for the Killer Clowns and Outer Space Clowns. But they'll never not make something visually striking, and they'll always make something work that you didn't think would work. And they made some crazy creatures for this movie. It's not necessarily that they're the best looking, but they are some of the most kinetic little creatures on this list. They can do things like spin across the floor like Sonic the Hedgehog and shoot pins out of their backs and eat bombs. In fact, what's interesting as well is probably like the most intentionally funny movie so far. It's also the most violent. And when they attack, we see like all the munching and tearing because they can afford the gore effects. And what's crazy is I don't even really think anyone actually dies in this, but what happens is almost worse to watch because it's people getting mauled over and over and over again by these little shits, and they still have to just carry on to the end with their injuries. And the creatures definitely have that Gremlins attitude back. They even cuss with each other. And they also love to have destruction parties like they do in Gremlins. A lot of great contributions for silly and grotesque death scenes for the critters. It's like for half the movie, they're just fighting, and the silliness is just paired with really well-acted despair and exhaustion. And it really did manage to push those chaotic moods of Gremlins a little further. You know, if anyone was going to make a sci-fi Gremlins ripoff, I think this is going to be about as good as anyone could expect. I think the only thing that doesn't quite get it to the top is how similar I feel like it was to Gremlins, and the ideas that made that movie great, while the other two so far really created a very different style of ugly little monster. So honestly, I just feel like I want to put it in the exact same place as Ghoulies on A. I have very little complaints, like it's just not a bad movie in any way. So now we're going to downgrade a little and get into the late 80s world of Roger Corman. Now, Roger Corman is basically a historical figure in movies and is a fascinating and complicated man. He's probably like the most well-respected hack ever. Even I don't say hack as an insult. I mean, this guy started all the way back in like the 1950s and seems to approach filmmaking as like a guerrilla warfare against major studios. I mean, there was a time where studios was the only way to ever get a movie made, which of course was very, very stifling. And the only way to financially compete with them would to do stuff like take footage and put it in 4 different movies. And any time a fad came up at all, over decades and decades and decades, he'd be sure to slap out something to ride the coattails. So really by this point in time, he has a movie in almost every single weird subgenre you can think of. But beneath it all, he's had an integrity that not even many famously good producers can uphold.
Nobody in there that he didn't, in the most important way, support.
But he really did pave the way for independent cinema in general, like completely, all of it. But Munchies is probably the lowest brow attempt at Gremlins so far. First of all, it's directed by Tina Hirsch, who, believe it or not, was the editor for the original Gremlins. So I'm going to let you decide if making a ripoff of a movie that you worked on 3 years later is betrayal or like a badass power move. I mean, it must have been noticed at this point that there's now been a horror, fantasy, and a sci-fi Gremlins ripoff, and the last corner of the video market was screwball comedy. And because of that, it's the first time where the blending of adult and children's entertainment starts to feel like genuinely weird. And everything is just mind-numbingly simple and dumb in a way that feels like it could only be trying to appeal to children. But the Munchies are drunk, horny, they like to party. And I paid attention this time and confirmed that the monsters are indeed named after weed munchies, because she makes a hash joke before she comes up with the name for them.
And you ate that bar of hash? Yeah, you thought it was a chunky? That's it.
What?
He's a munchie.
I mean, the story is just one of those really basic, we need to save the house or whatever.
You said you were going to sell me your half of the land when you got back. Well, here I am.
And we discovered these rat-looking creatures that we could maybe make money off of. And just like Gremlins, the first little creature is nice and everyone loves it. But even then, this creature is sneaking in between sheets of people doing the hanky-panky. Even makes a subtle jacking off joke, I'm pretty sure.
Sleazy teenage sex?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then in just like a fashion that feels extra brutal by the cartoonishness of everything else, he gets cut in half with a cleaver. And then we learn that they'll multiply now into mean clones once they die like that. Which is really one of the first moments in any of these where I thought to myself, like, this was directly lifted from Gremlins. And like when they get outside, the first thing the humans think to do is seduce them with a slinky dance. From there, it's really just a slapdash series of scenes of the Munchies hijacking a car and causing chaos for people and breaking rules. Now, I really don't know how many parents would let their kids watch this, nor do I know how many adults would want to watch this kind of thing at all. But I, for one, do think there's just something so obtuse about these ugly monsters just straight up shooting at old ladies with shotguns, and smoking by no smoking signs, and flipping off bikers they just ran off the road into a river. It's so brickheadedly dumb, it's hilarious to me, basically. And this movie doesn't even know when to turn it off. Like, someone actually dies in this movie that was kind of important, and they couldn't even slow down enough to not make more jokes about it.
Oh, is he dead?
Sure looks it. Look at this mess.
And I ought to mention that the most significant aspect about this movie is the visuals. There's one of those cliche scenes where one of the bad guys is chasing one of the Munchies around their house. And man, this house is something else. It's like if there was a Pee Wee Herman syndrome and this movie has an early onset case of it. But this is really how retrowave people think the 80s looked like. And I always say it was more rare than you thought, but this movie is really just full force groovy. It's not just this one set either, which is pretty typical. You find one cool set and stick with it. But there's this other ice cream shop that looks almost as amazing. The workers there have these bonkers costumes. And of course, you always gotta savor those rare moments with authentic video stores and burger shops. Even when they make their way to these underground tunnels, they still paint the barrels of toxic sludge these neon greens and reds to match the Munchies' sunglasses. That's a decision an artist would make. It's honestly, it's a mood I could really soak in when I'm too tired to think. Like, all the other movies we've watched so far are a lot more like meals, and this one feels a little bit more like a snack. If we're talking Gremlin ripoffs, Munchies is a solid B. Alright, we're now progressing to the late 80s, and we've already milked this market pretty well, right? You know, even after a Roger Corman screwball comedy version of Gremlins, we still have lower levels to reach. In 1988, Hobgoblins comes out and is the first Gremlin ripoff to really go full teen horror comedy, with no real concern with childlike wonder outside of, like, underdeveloped brains, maybe. Now, this is a movie that earned a little bit of notoriety by both getting covered by Mystery Science Theater and getting an Elvira release. Now, the honest reason why I think both of them covered this movie is because it was clearly very cheap to get their hands on the rights for it. So needless to say, because of that exposure, this movie has gotten a decent amount of thrashing over the years. People just aren't accustomed to super low budget genre movies. And honestly, I think people's expectations for what a filmmaker is supposed to do is just simply too narrow. Maybe the director's just a Joe Schmo who, like me, really liked watching all these Gremlins ripoffs and thought he could make one for himself so there could just be another one out there for people to watch. Like, the burden to have a unique vision is simply unnecessary. Horror fans are easy to entertain, and I love them for it. In fact, when you know you don't have the chops or resources to pull off something like Troll or Critters, natural thing to do is just celebrate all the dumbest aspects of the genre. But still what we have is a very basic concept of another teen movie with gremlin-like creatures, which means having a script is only a hurdle to pass in getting the movie made. And it's true that it appeals to that 80s mentality that being horny is one of the funniest things that can ever happen in a movie.
What? Don't you ever get any tapes from the adult section? My boyfriend would never bring me a tape that didn't have at least a single X rating.
The sex jokes in Munchies is almost funny because of how out of place they are. I was constantly surprised at how raunchy this nudity-free movie was.
Because the rug's daft.
Same color as the carpet burns on my knees, Nick.
But I'm not gonna say like the bubblegummy feel of the previous Gremlin ripoffs is completely lost. Like, talking about goofing off with tropes, the very obvious thing about these so far is that it's a challenge to make a little monster attack look real. They're always stretching themselves to make sure they don't show the bottom half because it's a puppet with a hand in it, or they show the attack off screen. This movie was like, let's make creatures with quite literally zero articulation and purposely show people fake wrestling with them for long periods of time. And this is where I confront haters of bad movies and I ask, how can you not watch this and see a type of beauty in it? And of course, they're using their neighbor's house, so they couldn't possibly get the color palettes of the previous movies down.
I probably should have looked at the interior first. It's white walls, a white couch, they own nothing.
You know, it's a big difference between having something and knowing how to use it.
But at least they worked in some really incredible 80s fashion. And they got some fake fog and colored floodlights, which is a key move for any low-budget filmmaker. But very little of this movie makes much sense. Even after the security guard guy in the movie explains the plot for like 5 minutes straight, it still doesn't make sense.
The power they had, I slowly began to destroy everyone around me becoming rich or famous. But mostly I'm too old to catch up with them now. But you might still have a chance.
I'm pretty suspicious that what happened was they got like 20 minutes of movie finish stretching the gremlin wrestling out and had to come up with some other angle to finish it. So there's this bizarre angle where they have the power to make you hallucinate or something, which for reasons I don't completely get, but that leads us to this incredible club that I think they named it Club Scum, where they play rockabilly and new wave music. You know, there's tinsel and other stuff you might decorate a high school party with. And there's this incredible beehive hairdo. It's really a nice non-Hollywood time capsule of the times. It's also almost Hobgoblin free for the last chunk of the movie, with the exception of like one of the laziest gremlin room trashing scenes we've seen so far. Now, Hobgoblins, it shares more in common with the loads of video trash that was being made at this time, much more so than it does with Gremlins. And I would say it definitely has like the least ambitious vision so far. It's true that it doesn't hurt that I do like some of the screwball trash that influenced it, but things are definitely deteriorating for this genre so far. I'm gonna have to call this a C-movie classic, for sure. That's where this belongs. Now, how could things get worse? Well, Hobgoblins was very independent, okay, but Beasties, the next movie, is approaching backyard filmmaking quality. Not only is Beasties shot on Super 8 cheap, Rick Sloan, the guy behind Hobgoblins, actually continued on with somewhat of a career in film. But this guy, Stephen Paul Contreras, this is his first and only venture into filmmaking. David Dakota, that saint, tries to distribute this with like 200 copies being made, and had to pull it because even those didn't sell. So we're in a very obscure territory, but it is in the category and I need to talk about it. I'm going to start with something nice and say that when you're a true amateur with nearly no resources, no matter how bad the movie is, it still takes like a huge amount of ambition and effort to make it actually happen. I mean, there's just an attitude there that I'm always going to admire. And I'll say it over and over, doing something like this, no matter how it turns out, is more valuable than like 100 years of being a film critic. It stays in that comfortable low-budget teen horror lane, and at this point, the Spielberg nostalgia is just dead in the dirt.
What's wrong? You two look like you filled your shorts with shit.
This is cheap, okay? Shooting Super 8 at night is a rough choice, mainly because no one who's shooting with a Super 8 has good lighting equipment. So much of this you're trying to squint to see. The soundtrack is very obviously someone completely improvising on a keyboard while playing with only one finger. And what you can learn to expect from these types of movies is having people talk to each other is very cheap to shoot. and Little Monster Carnage isn't. So you can figure out what this movie has more of. You know, stuff like teens bickering with each other, flirting with each other, hanging out in cars, which just seems to be something they did a lot in the 80s. Although I was pretty surprised at how cute the little romance that developed was.
I mean, this whole night seems to be special. Running into the craft, and running into this egg, and, well, most of all, running into you.
That almost never happens, especially in a movie of this quality. But even when we're dealing with amazing movie punks, which is a huge bonus for any movie from this era, I just could not give a rip about anything any of them were saying. I kind of get the impression the director has a knack for designing stuff, but not so much for the actual movie part of things. The creatures are somehow awesome and terrible at the same time. They're goopy and gross in a cool way, but they're also kind of like a kid's puppet show in a bad way. But worst of all, there's only like a solid minute of them on screen. In fact, I'd almost say that there's a very small quality movie in here where the nerd character goes into these impressive sets, honestly, for this budget, and finds these sloppy alien gut stuff and goes on a surreal journey into more like cavernous areas where there's some special effects creatures that are seriously just bizarre and astounding. That is real creativity. But it also seems like that like barely took up a feature-length movie, so he had to add this little evil punk side story who worshiped this like incredible Skull King, and it's honestly very, very beautiful, but it goes sadly underutilized. Even that ran out pretty quickly, and then he had to fill in the rest with just vague teen stuff, which nobody likes. You might want to have things like this blobby uterus alien monster and underground punk death cults explained to you. How does that all fit together? But I promise you, you'll enjoy the image that you're having in your brain right now far more than you're going to have watching this movie. But you know, shit happens when you don't know what you're doing, but doing it anyway. So I am going to sadly put it on a D level, okay? It's where it is. So this is where I'm going to have to say this is the worst movie on the list, okay? It's not the last, there's more, but I think this is the historical core, a very good historical spread of what's happened to this genre. Make more little monster movies, okay?